Well, I named my talk Lotus in the Sea of Fire, Engaged Buddhism, because in Thich Nhat Hanh's books, if he talks about engaged Buddhism, he also talks about Lotus in the Sea of Fire. So I just thought it was very appropriate. So my name is Jeanne Lowry, and I'm currently a member of the Mindfulness Center in the Order of Interbeing. Steve and I have also been leading a Buddhist group at the First Unitarian Society in Milwaukee for the past 10 years. In that group, we have a fairly stable group of people, and we read different books, kind of like we do in our Sangha, but we kind of read them cover to cover, unless we get sick of it. And I've watched the Dharma really flower in many people through our Sangha, including Dave. So I'm going to talk about socially engaged Buddhism. But my journey with engaged Buddhism started outside of Buddhism. My journey with engaged spirituality started outside of Buddhism. Engaged Buddhism is one of the key teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. It's reflected in his life and expressed in a lovely book called Call Me by My True Names, which we'll read a poem from later. It may be good for us to connect with this part of the teachings. Central to the engaged Buddhist perspective and teaching is insight into interbeing and an understanding of responsibility that arises from this insight. We exist within a web of mutuality, never separate from each other. This is reflected in Thay's poem, Interbeing, which I will read. And I probably won't read it as well as he did, but I'll give it a shot. The sun has entered me. The sun has entered me together with the cloud and the river. I myself have entered the river, and I have entered the sun with the cloud and the river. There has not been a moment when we do not interpenetrate. But before the sun entered me, the sun was in me. Also the cloud and the river. I was already in it. There has not been a moment when we have not interbeen. Funny word. Therefore you know that as long as you continue to breathe, I continue to be in you. I was drawn to the teachings of engaged spirituality when I was in my 20s, and I read a book about Dorothy Day. The book was a biography of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. And Dorothy asked the question, what are we here for? What is the meaning of our lives? And she answered, service to the poor as an act of worship. Dorothy Day was a radical Catholic layperson who immersed herself in the social issues of the day with the aim of transforming individuals and transforming society. Her philosophy fosters pacifism, personal responsibility for all people, including the poor. Those among us who suffer affliction and oppression call our attention, often due to our social structure. They cannot defend themselves. They seldom have a voice in the decisions that shape their lives. Dorothy Day founded the Catholic worker movement in the midst of the Depression. The movement started with a newspaper called The Catholic Worker, and she then eventually moved to forming houses of hospitality, where communities of men and women opened their doors to those who were less needy than them, less well off than themselves. So people came that were hungry, homeless, and abandoned, came to the door. Feeding, clothing, and sheltering were their main objectives in the spirit of service and equality. Dorothy believed in voluntary poverty, in joining the poor in their struggles. It seems to be compassion for the suffering that distinguishes this approach, as well as a sense of equality with those who are looked on and exploited. For example, Dorothy never had a private room in the house. She just slept in the common room with the women. She served the community in many ways. She helped cook the meals, ate with the people. There was never a social service office. Eventually, houses started in many cities across the country. Some continue to operate today. In fact, there's one in Milwaukee, and it's called Casa Maria, and they have several houses on a block in downtown Milwaukee. During the 60s, I was a nurse in mainstream health care. Dorothy was talking about racism, exploitation of laborers, and justice for all people in the community. When Martin Luther King died, Dorothy reinforced his message that all people can live together as families. Sangha, right? One of Dorothy's main convictions was pacifism, just like Thich Nhat Hanh. During the Vietnam War, she supported conscientious objectors and advocated only nonviolent protest. She was a founder of a group called Pax Christi, which I was involved in my early days, and it turned my heart to the struggle for justice and peace, and especially against nuclear weapons. As a young woman inspired by her example, I decided that my life's work should be with the poor. And I began by working in community health centers. And then, in time, starting a program at the Red Cross, specifically for people who had mental illness and were staying in shelters. I understood what Dorothy said when she said serving was an act of worship. It seemed to me that when I was with the homeless, poor, and disadvantaged, or when I worked for peace, I was in the loving presence of a divine compassion holding us. I was transformed by these acts of service. I learned that we are most truly ourselves when we are engaged in caring and compassionate activity. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories to illustrate this. One night, I remember I walked into the guest house, at the time it was actually a shelter for men and women, but it's now a shelter for men. I was asked to see an African American gentleman who had been sent by ambulance from the emergency room to the shelter. And he was sitting in the office, and I looked at his legs, and they were full of open sores. He had been in the waiting room at the hospital for several days, and nobody even saw him. We were not able to accommodate him at the shelter. So I managed to get him in my car, and I took him back to the emergency room. The ER looked at him and said, "What are you doing? Take him back." And when I talked him into having a doctor see him. He needed emergency surgery. People didn't see this man because he was not someone that mattered. He was invisible because of his homelessness, his race, and the unconscious bias of the staff of the ER. And he might have been that way to me too, had I not encountered Dorothy's Day's spirituality, which identified suffering people with the suffering of the world. And I'm not really bragging. I'm afraid that it might sound like that. But I'm just telling a couple stories. In another situation, I was called by a mother who was worried about her adult son who had quit his job as an architect. He had become very paranoid, and he refused to stay with his mother or go to a shelter. So he would walk the streets all day and all night. He finally agreed to move into a room in this really seedy room and board facility. And he would not leave his room. The staff would put a little food outside the door, kind of like they do at kennels with dogs. So I just started to visit him every week. And I would knock on the door, and he'd say, "Who's there?" And I'd say, "Jeanne," and that would be it. He wouldn't open the door. So after many months of going once a week to see him, he finally said, "I'm really having trouble sleeping." And I said, "Who? Can I bring somebody by to see you?" So I brought my friend, the psychiatrist, by, who ordered a little medication for him. And in time, he accepted treatment and moved to Colorado to be with his mother. From this, I learned that you just can't walk up to somebody and because you think you know what's best, they're going to do it. You can't just fix people. You have to be present and listen, because listening was a really big part of this. Even in the beginning, there were no words, but just listen. And you had to offer yourself to them and not give up. So every week, I would go by, even though he wouldn't open the door. It helped me tremendously to heal my own impatience and arrogance. always the one who knew what was best. You know, I am a nurse after all. I learned from the teachings of Dorothy Day much that was helpful, but I became disillusioned with the Catholic Church. I did what many Catholics do. I went to the Unitarian Universalist Church. And then eventually starting this group at the church and finding out about Thai, and this engaged Buddhism really resonated with me. But the teachings were a little bit different, in part because of the Buddhist teachings of interdependence, non-duality, and Buddha nature. The poem which is on your handout, From Call Me By My True Names, is such a great view of interdependence. I am a frog swimming happily in the clear water of a pond, and I am the grass snake that silently fed itself on the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks. And I am the merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old refugee on a boat who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. So for me, this was a continuation of a journey that started early in my life. Now, as a retired person, I find myself drawn to cultivate social justice in my heart and in our Sangha. Thich Nhat Hanh interprets the Buddhist teaching, socially engaged Buddhism, as a radical transformational practice, peacemaking at the roots. Thai says there is no separation between socially engaged and non-socially engaged Buddhism. It's all socially engaged. The way we live our lives is socially engaged, practiced. Thai writes, this is a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, "We think we need an enemy. It is not correct to believe the world's situation is in the hands of the government, and if only the president would have correct policies, there would be peace. Our daily lives have the most to do with the situation of the world. If we can change our lives, we can change our governments, and we can change our world. Our presidents and our governments are us. They reflect our lifestyles and our way of thinking. The way we hold our tea, pick up a newspaper, and even use toilet paper have to do with being peace, always and everywhere." And it just isn't private work, inner work. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, in her book Radical Dharma, love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. The arenas of public structure and global institutions, as well as consciousness, are included in Thai's teachings. Thai says, we have to remember that our body is not limited to what lies within the boundary of our skin. There is no phenomena in the universe that does not intimately concern us. To save ourselves is to save our children and our grandchildren. We protect the earth because we are motivated by compassion. When we stop the blaming and killing, we will recognize the nature of interbeing. When I joined the Order of Interbeing in 2014, it was a continuation of my heartfelt desire to be of service. According to the Charter of the Order of Interbeing, the aim of the Order is to actualize Buddhism by studying, experimenting with, and applying Buddhism in daily life. The Charter lists 4 principles as a foundation of the Order. They are non-attachment to views, direct experimentation, appropriateness, and skillful means. For me, this means I must let go of my own ideas and be willing to do deep listening, to be open to the ideas of others. Try the teachings out to be sure I understand and can implement these teachings and begin to understand the truths of the Buddha. My actions must be in line with the situation I am in. To look at each situation with compassionate understanding. In order to implement these actions, using skillful means that addresses the needs of the people I'm serving. Engaged Buddhism is the willingness and ability to stand in a situation, to look around, and to respond skillfully and compassionately to the people who are there. I will end with the original version of the 4th mindfulness training of the Order of Interbeing. The 4th mindfulness training, awareness of suffering. Aware that looking deeply at the nature of suffering can help us develop compassion and find ways out of suffering. We are determined not to avoid or close our eyes before suffering. We are committed to finding ways, including personal contact, images and sounds, to be with those who suffer so we can understand their situation deeply and help them transform their suffering into compassion, peace, and joy. We will practice conscious breathing and walking to look deeply into the roots of suffering. I offer these words to Thai, to the worldwide Sangha, to you, and to all beings everywhere. May we find peace. Thank you.